Homebrewed Christianity listeners, this is Trip, and today we have a very special episode. It's going to be a little bit of science, religion, eco-philosophy, and more. Going to talk some Whitehead, some Schelling, some Jung, all of that with Matthew David Segall, and it's coming up. But first, I just want to let you know, Homebrewed Christianity Deacons, that we are excited about all sorts of stuff coming your way. We got some great interviews. We have a number of live events. And most of all, Bo and I are getting excited about recording some new Theology Nerd Throwdown episodes, discussing and responding to the questions you've been posting on the SpeakPipe at homebrewedchristianity.com. So go there, hit up the SpeakPipe, give us some more topics, questions, and stuff to cover. Because I'm just looking forward to us having to sit down and do like 3 or 4 episodes in a row because the questions are so exciting. But if you were in Southern California, February 26th, that's at the end of this week, then come to the Level Ground Film Festival in Pasadena, California. That film festival that covers the intersection of faith, gender, and sexuality. Because the kickoff party, there's going to be a podcast with your favorite podcast. I won't tell you who, but I'm in it. Anyway. Then, March 4th, at the Loft in Los Angeles, Westwood to be exact, is a live podcast with our friend, Doug Paget, or Paget. I have found out, he told me personally, that I'm a Pagetian. That is that school of thought that loves Doug Paget's thought. So if you want to be a Pagetian, or are one, and you're in Los Angeles on March 4th, come to the Loft. Enjoy the live podcast, and then go out with us afterwards. We're going to go grab some drinks, chat it up, and it's going to be all swell. You know what I'm saying? But here's the thing. The 13th and 14th, completely free. You don't have to be in Villanova, at Villanova University. You don't have to be in Pennsylvania. You can just go on over, click through, and you can attend live streaming The End of Religion, Faith in a Postmodern Age. It's a 2-day live event with our friends Jeffrey Robbins, Merrill Westphal, and the one and only JC, Jacques Caputo. That's right. So, The End of Religion, ? Faith in a Postmodern Age. You can come to Pennsylvania, Villanova University, or you could attend online, just right there, streaming for free. Yeah. In your underwear, like you're like, I'm gonna sit here, I'm gonna have a drink, and I'm gonna just watch this. Yeah, whoo, you could do that. If you live in Chicago or nearby on March 18th, then come join Scott Paith and I for a Theology Nerd Boot Camp. It's the day before the Progressive Youth Ministry Conference starts, which, of course, I'm going to be at, and you should come there for the live podcast Friday night. Peter Rollins is going to be there. So, like we're both leaving home and here in the South Bay of Los Angeles, and we're going to then be leaving to the same place. But you can see both of us and a bunch of our other friends right there at Progressive Youth Ministry. Tony Jones is going to be there. He's not dodging the battle of Au Contraire Mon Frere at the PYM this year. No. He can't get out of it. He's going down. You hear that, Tony? You're going down. So, if you are going to PYM, come a day early, Theology Nerd Boot Camp with Trip, that's me, Scott Paith, Niebuhr, Moltmann, Theologian Extraordinaire at DePaul. Have fun. Then go to PYM. It's going to be epic. And on Friday night, Phillips Theological Seminary is sponsoring the podcast live. Yep. Oh, I forgot to even tell you, we got another sponsor for that night, The Hatchery. The Hatchery sponsoring the podcast. And they're getting pint glasses for everyone that comes. That's right, pint glasses. And we're going to put stuff in them because we're givers. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. All right. So those are a bunch of live events. The last thing I wanted to tell you is that coming up, we're starting a new high gravity class. Pete and I are starting a high gravity class. We're not doing atheism for Lent this year. We're doing Paul. That's right. Pete and I, the first Monday of March, we'll start a high gravity class on Paul, the Apostle. We're going to have a Bible-thon, a teach-in, you could say. The first night, 3 hours of biblical excitement with Daniel Kirk, New Testament professor at Fuller. And then we're going to have 5 sessions where we walk through 3 important philosophical engagements with Paul for political purposes. We're going to do Jacob Talbus, then we're going to do Alain Badiou, and then Slavoj Žižek. That's right. We're going to be walking through the books and just nerding out, geeking out all over the place. and it's going to be like over 10 hours of excitement, and you can stream it all, download it after, and all that for $30. So it's like you're like $1 an hour or something like that. You can relive it. It's not $1 an hour. It's like $3 an hour or something. Whatever. It's cheap, and it's fun, and it's nerdy, and you can join live. You can download and listen after. You could relive the experience for the rest of your life. Yeah, right on your iPod, which I know is what everyone wants to do. You can talk to us on the message board. You can ask questions in the live chat. You can ask me to pinch Pete while he's talking, or tickle him. He's very ticklish. I don't know if you knew that, but he is. He's very ticklish. Anyway, so just head on over to homebrewedchristianity.com. You'll find out info about all these live events and everything coming up. And remember, you can support the podcast. Just go there, click support. You can review it on iTunes. Click through, share it with your friends. Review it on Stitcher, my favorite podcasting app. You can click through the Amazon link. Anything you buy, like books, we get a little percentage kickback. Doesn't change your shopping experience. You can become a regular donor. We had a couple new ones this month. And they just click in like every month. Just a $5 donation. Boom. And you're like a permanent deacon on the reg. You don't have to remember. That's exciting. And, you can make a one-time donation and sponsor the podcast, because this next episode of the TNT has a very special sponsor. And I'm not going to tell you right now because it's a secret, but very soon you'll find out. So, here you go. The next episode with Matthew and the one and only Jesse Turry doing the interview. Peace.
Can you give me a spiritual biography / intellectual biography? So give me your influences, and I'd like to hear, about the people who influenced you, who you've read, who've influenced your thought and your philosophy.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start just with, my upbringing. I had a mother who was kind of non-denominational Christian, who really her source of Christian doctrine was from various televangelists. So we didn't go to church that much, but she really thought that I should know and understand the Bible, and it was an important part of growing up, was this recognition coming from my mom that this is an important tradition and one needs to have an orientation towards God. She had a very particular understanding of what or who God is, that as I grew older seemed too narrow and confining for me. My dad is Jewish, kind of in a strange way that only Jewish people can be. He's a Jewish atheist.
Yeah.
Where there's a sort of relationship. I think Catholics can do that too, actually,
yeah.
Where, one almost comes to still have a relationship with God, but it's like a negative relationship with God, where you wish that God would just leave you alone, so
Yep.
you didn't have to deal with it.
Exactly.
But there's still that relationship happening.
It's like you're in a mob.
Right.
If you're Catholic or Jewish, it's like you're part of the family. You can't leave.
Yeah, exactly. You can't escape. So, my parents got divorced when I was about 9 or 10, and it wasn't until that point that their desire to sort of leave a religious imprint on me from their background became more pronounced. And so they sort of fought over which I was going to be, a Jew or a Christian, and that sort of really turned me off. And by the time I was 11 or 12, I started really getting interested in science and in rationalism and atheism.
Sure.
So I started reading Stephen Hawking and Richard Dawkins, and this was before the Four Horsemen of the Atheist Apocalypse started writing all their famous books. But I really, as I got into my younger teens, 13, 14, 15, I was pretty outspoken as an atheist and thought that religion was, the opiate of the masses, or just poisoning people's minds, and that really science was the new worldview that people should adopt if we hope to move forward as a species. But then things really changed when I was 16 or 17. I took a course in psychology with a really great teacher in high school. Mr. Ennis was his name. He was from Germany, immigrated to the United States when he was a teenager, and he had this German philosophical background. He was really into, Nietzsche, Carl Jung, and Alan Watts, and he introduced me to these thinkers. And it was, I think, what really started to change my mind about religion and understanding the deeper role that it plays in forming people's psyches, shaping their souls, and shaping the inner life of our species for thousands of years. It was Carl Jung. He gave me a psychological perspective on religion that I hadn't considered before. And I looked at religion in a historical way for the first time and recognized that, what would Europe have looked like without the Catholic Church? Well, it probably would have been way more fragmented. There would have been warring tribes. There was plenty of violence that was caused by the church, but I think maybe less than there would have been without the church. And in terms of literacy and philosophy and culture generally, without the church, I don't know what institution would have been able to protect that ancient knowledge that through the Dark Ages especially would have probably been lost.
Yeah.
So there are all these ways that, religion provided this protective shelter for the species. And yeah, at a certain point it became oppressive and smothering, and people, the Protestant Reformation needed to happen, and then secularity needed to come forth. But in some sense, science and secularism wouldn't have been possible without the preparation that was put in place psychologically, culturally, politically by the church. So reading these thinkers in my junior and senior year of high school really started to shift my perspective. And I started to get into Eastern philosophy and Eastern spirituality. I started thinking of myself as a Buddhist. And what I later came to understand is that I was, receiving the most high-level mystical versions of these Eastern traditions. And so idealizing the entirety of the East as though somehow they didn't also have dogmatic religious beliefs and people just going through the motions to be part of a community or what have you, just like we have in the West here. So eventually I stopped idealizing the East and realized that the West has its own esoteric, intellectually sophisticated understanding of what God is and what it means to be in relationship to a divine ground of being and so on. Sure. So then I and largely as a result of being influenced by Jung, again, who said, Westerners shouldn't turn east for their religious nourishment because our psyche is shaped by our own culture, and whether we like it or not, we're swimming in a basically Christian context, and so our psyche is primed to be deeply affected by Christian symbols.
Interesting.
And if we turn to Buddhism or Taoism or Hinduism or what have you, the symbols might still speak to us, but at a more superficial level.
Interesting.
So, as a result of that strong Jungian influence, I started taking Western religion and Western esotericism, especially Hermeticism, alchemy, Gnosticism, more seriously. And I did find a lot of spiritual nourishment in those traditions. Actually, another major shift for me, kind of away from the East as my major point of orientation, was the first time I engaged in any psychedelic use.
Sure.
So, here I was in college thinking of myself as a Buddhist, kind of shunning Western religions as dualistic and authoritarian and whatever. And then I ate some mushrooms when I was 19 and had an experience of encountering Christ.
Yeah.
Unexpectedly. And that really confirmed what I had been reading Jung say, that our psyche is, as Westerners, is just primed for these archetypes, and you can't escape that, whether you want to or not. So yeah, in college I was very influenced by existentialism, and I majored in cognitive science, so I was studying consciousness and neurophysiology, and trying to really grapple with that last sort of scientific mystery that there haven't been any convincing theories for how consciousness could emerge out of an otherwise materialistic universe. Right. And then I didn't really find any satisfying approaches to answering that question until I discovered Whitehead.
Yeah.
And I tried to read him in college. He wasn't being taught at my university, so I couldn't study him with a professor or with other students until I got to CIIS.
Right.
So I didn't actually start diving into Whitehead's thought in a serious way until 2008.
Okay.
But he very quickly became my major point of philosophical orientation, and I've been orbiting around Whitehead's works for 7 or 8 years now.
One of the things you write about a lot on your blog is what you call etheric imagination. Is that right?
Yeah, etheric imagination.
Etheric. Can you talk about that? Explain about what that is and why it's important in philosophy and also perhaps science.
Yeah. So this is my dissertation topic, basically, and I'm drawing together the thought of 3 different thinkers: Whitehead, Friedrich Schelling, the German idealist, and Rudolph Steiner, who was a 20th century esotericist.
Yeah.
And Whitehead developed his own sort of ether theory in response to Einstein. Schelling also had his own ether theory, and these are natural scientific theories to account for how light radiates and electromagnetism and so on. Maxwell's first unification of electricity and magnetism was based on an ether that was not yet detectable and seems to still remain undetectable. We can sort of detect the effects that it may be causing, but we can't actually detect the ether. So it's sort of, in the natural sciences, the ether sort of represents this unacknowledged spiritual component. And, nowadays, since Einstein, physicists won't talk about the ether anymore, because Einstein, when he first was publishing his theories of special and general relativity, he thought that he was doing away with the ether as an unnecessary baggage, that because we couldn't detect it, we may as well just get rid of it and use his equations instead. Right. But Einstein later came to realize that he had just replaced the old ether with a new ether called space-time, the space-time fabric. Okay, it's a new ether. Just like, science often forgets its own history and talks about phlogiston and, caloric and these what now they think of as superstitious pseudoscientific ideas, but for practicing scientists then, these were really important operational concepts that help them make sense of the data and observations they're making and so on. We do the same thing today. We have the Higgs field, and we're using this particle accelerator to detect its effects. We can't actually detect the Higgs field. We can detect its effects and make inference and say, oh, it might exist. So science is working with these various forms of ether theories. And what my argument in my dissertation is that because of the way that modern science sort of repressed the cognitive or epistemological role of imagination, and said that imagination couldn't be used for serious scientific observation and theorization. It repressed it, and it ended up unconsciously projecting imagination onto nature as the ether, this all-pervading medium that connects all things and explains any visible phenomenon that you need it to, and so on. So I'm trying to retrieve this role that imagination has played sort of covertly in science by looking at the history of the ether theory, and tying it to what Rudolph Steiner says about the ether on a more esoteric level. Okay. So for Steiner, the ether is sort of that extra dimension of reality. See, he has a very more textured ontology than standard materialism or physicalism. Like he acknowledges the physical, but then says that there are these other layers or sheaths that intermix with and penetrate into the physical, or the physical being sort of the visible world that we detect with our senses. And the etheric is that level of reality that's just a little bit subtler than the visible physical world, and it's what allows for, the mineral dimension to become alive as vegetation or plants. So for Steiner, the plant realm is sort of that the first visible effect of the ether penetrating into the material world. And then one level subtler than the ether is the astral, or the level of soul. So you get plants with the ether, and then animals when the astral layer penetrates.
Interesting.
And then there's the spiritual level, which has to do with only the human being fully participates in the spiritual level for Steiner, which has to do with our sense of ego, or individuality, our sense of I, like the first person pronoun.
Sure.
So for Steiner, animals have some participation in that spiritual dimension, but for him, he would say that an entire animal species, like all gazelle or all lions, they share a species ego. So their sense of individuality is sort of spread through the species, whereas with human beings, our sense of individuality is located within each one of us, and it's as if each individual human being is its own species. That's how much more unique and capable of freedom, free expression, free action that humans are than an animal species. And obviously the spiritual permeates the entirety of the universe down to the physical, but it reveals itself more at these various levels. So in my dissertation, I'm focusing in on the etheric dimension, in particular, just to sort of make it apparent that if we only look at the physical, visible, measurable dimension of reality, that we're missing a whole lot, and that basically we can't even understand the plant realm in a materialistic way, much less the animal or the spiritual. So I'm trying to open the door to a more, spiritual ontology by just looking at this very basic connection between the physical and the etheric. And for Steiner, accessing the etheric isn't something you can do with your physical senses. You have to cultivate a higher organ of perception, which he calls imagination.
That's great.
Yeah. So he gives examples of thinkers like Goethe, German poet who was also a scientist, studied plant morphology. He studied and he critiqued Newton's theory of color and articulated his own alternative theory of color. And Steiner says that Goethe was using imagination, or what I'm calling etheric imagination, in order to penetrate into this subtler dimension of reality that gives shape to plants. And Goethe was, as a scientist, as an artist, a poet, was more sensitive to these dimensions than most other people were. And I'm trying to bring in Whitehead and Schelling to say they were also more sensitive to this subtler dimension of reality. For Whitehead, that's the dimension of process. It's the dimension, when he, in Modes of Thought, he has a chapter called Nature Alive. And it's Whitehead penetrating with his imagination to that deeper layer of reality where he can take in the creative, developmental time dimension, or the growth dimension of things, that with a standard form of empiricism where you're just looking at snapshots of the sensory world as you observe it, you're going to miss that. You're going to try to piece together growth and development in an atomic way, in a fragmented way, and you're not going to see the wholeness that unfolds through time, because that requires, a higher order form of thought and perception that I think etheric imagination provides. So I'm trying to legitimize the conscious use and cultivation of etheric imagination in the philosophy of nature and in science. I think it's been operating unconsciously, through all these ether theories that I mentioned at the start. Yeah. But I want to make it more conscious and explicit so that science recognizes what it's doing and can begin to cultivate that organ of perception on purpose, right, to deepen its understanding of the universe and to prevent us from the sort of incoherent, bifurcated understanding of reality that, for the most part, natural science is still operating within.
It's interesting to me. It makes me think of, I work at a small liberal arts school in Pennsylvania, and we had Catherine Eldrin visit from Harvard. She's an epistemologist, but she also writes on aesthetics. And it reminds me of what she talks about a little bit. And it's basically that science and art are both ways of accessing reality or investigating reality. And they both kind of do it the same way. And she writes about thought experiments. I'll have to send you some papers that she wrote. She writes a lot of essays. But she talks about how science, when science experiments are actually kind of fictions when you think about it. Because they're not technically, they're not investigating the real world necessarily, because by definition, an experiment, you have to isolate certain aspects of reality. In order to
just like a painting needs to be framed. Yeah. An experiment is framed. It's in a laboratory, it's in an artificial situation where the scientist is interfering with nature in a very particular way in order to provoke a response. And it's just impractical to think that we could experiment on the universe itself. Yeah. Experiments always require designing a particular frame or a particular measuring instrument. It's going to give you the kind of response or feedback that you programmed it to give you. And it's not going to give you a picture of the whole. Yes. So it's just kind of like a painting in that way. It needs to be framed.
It is. And she mentions thought experiments. So she talks about fiction too. So like in a novel, but also a thought experiment in philosophy. These aren't things that are necessarily meant to be physically realized. But she writes that they nevertheless enhance understanding of the phenomena they pertain to. So you can learn about a family, by reading a story about a family and how that family interacts in that story. Just like you can, just like how Einstein talks about riding a light wave, right? A thought experiment in that sense. Yeah, we can learn about reality by imagining. I love that idea.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's an important connection to draw, the one between art and science, because imagination is crucial for both.
one talk you recently gave, I guess, at CIIS was about psychedelics and the extended mind thesis. Can you give us a rundown on that?
Yeah. Hopefully the video of that talk will be uploaded soon.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, I gave a talk for a student group, and they're actually going to be a nonprofit organization pretty soon here, called ERIE, Entheogenic Research, Integration, and Education.
Okay.
It's a great group. Their website's erievision.org. They have a lot of other videos of great talks. And what I talked about, was using this so-called extended mind thesis that was developed first in a 1998 paper by David Chalmers, a really well-known philosopher who focuses on consciousness.
Okay.
He's the one that articulated sort of the hard problem of consciousness. How do you get mind from matter, basically? Right. And Andy Clark, they co-wrote this paper. Andy Clark's a cognitive scientist. He's at the University of Edinburgh, I think. And what they argued in this paper is, and really looking more at the way that technology in particular extends our cognition. It augments our cognition. It allows us to think thoughts that we wouldn't otherwise be able to think if we just had our brain.
Interesting. Yeah, sure.
So they give examples like the alphabet, writing as a technology that enabled human beings to totally transform and extend the way that we think. So think about long division, and you can use a piece of paper and a pencil to divide two huge numbers in a minute that if you tried to do in your head, you'd probably not be able to do it, or it would take you a long time.
Right.
And you'd have no way of checking your work. You wouldn't know where you made the mistake. And versus on paper, you can very clearly have this thought process unfold externally outside of your brain, and you can watch it happen on the paper. It began with the alphabet, and I mean, even before the alphabet, when we were using tools, simple stone tools and whatnot, it's changing the way we think about the world. It's changing how we form concepts about the world. And so it just, by using these examples, they were just trying to point out the way that thinking was never just in the head. Thinking is, first of all, an embodied activity. And second of all, because the body is coupled with its environment, thinking is an environmentally extended activity. Yeah. And it's become more obvious nowadays with computers and smartphones. I don't remember anyone's phone number anymore.
Yeah, me either.
I don't remember. I know their name, and I ask my phone to dial them for me. I don't remember my calendar anymore. I have to look at my calendar in my iPhone every morning for my week schedule. Yeah. Because if the phone's going to do that for me, I'm going to use my mind, my brain, to focus on other things.
Right. So
we sort of offloaded all of this cognitive activity into these computing systems in our environment now. And Andy Clark and David Chalmers make a big deal of this and say that, for all intents and purposes, our mind is now part of this larger network, and that eventually, as this process of technological integration continues, we're just our mind is going to be seamlessly integrated with the World Wide Web. So, they're focusing on technology, and I'm trying to connect this to psychedelics. And the connection that I see there is that, our organism, our human embodiment has been co-evolving with various psychedelic plants and fungi for millions of years. And that's why, there are these neurochemicals that are being produced as part of the metabolic activity of these plants that plug directly into the receptors in our nervous system and alter our consciousness in very reliable ways. And it seems to me that it makes more sense in an ecological way, in a biological way, to talk about the human nervous system not as just something stuck inside the head, but if there are neurochemicals being produced by these other organisms in our environment, and if we've always been in this coevolutionary symbiotic relationship with them, the regulation of our neurochemistry has required entering into relationships with these other organisms in our environment. So our mind is ecological in its extent. It's not simply inside the skull. And so it's that ecological relationship that I think lends credence to an extended mind theory, not just extended into technology, but extended into biological organisms in our environment. And, anyone who's, been adventurous enough to experiment with these substances will know that the sort of consciousness that they evoke is very ecological. All of a sudden, these hidden connections that you were never conscious of rise to the surface, and you begin to see how, in some ways, how terrifyingly connected we are to everything else that's happening. Yeah. In my first talk, I was trying to sort of redeem or do some, what Michel Foucault would call counter memory, look back at the origins of Western culture, and instead of seeing it as the Greeks as totally focused on just rationality, analytic thought, geometry, and so on, to just remind people that they were all, the pre-Socratic philosophers, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and really every Greek person, man or woman, slave or aristocrat, they were all participants in this psychedelic mystery religion at Eleusis, the Eleusinian mystery rites, where basically they would be, over a series of years, they'd be initiated deep into the lower mysteries and the higher mysteries, and they were dosing on a fungus called ergot, which is basically LSD. And the psychedelic experience with the ritual container that had to do with the mythology around Demeter, the earth goddess, and the mystery of how seeds in soil are born again as new life, and the cycle of the death, rebirth mystery through vegetation. This all provided a sort of ritual symbolic context that catalyzed the psychedelic experience, so that basically these initiates were allowed to die spiritually before the death of their physical bodies. And so they left that experience with an understanding of this cycle, and that death is not the end. In many ways, it's the beginning. And so that sort of shamanic experience is right at the root of our culture and of the philosophical background that gave rise to our culture. And I think with the rise of the Enlightenment a few hundred years ago, we sort of rewrote history, marginalized that side of things, and emphasized the rational sort of daytime consciousness that, the Greek thinkers also developed, but there was a more holistic integration of daytime rational thinking and sort of nighttime psychedelic thinking that has been lost. And so, I wanted to try to redeem that, to remind us that we don't need to in a similar way that we don't need to turn, as wonderful as these other traditions are, as a Westerner, we don't need to look to the East for spiritual nourishment. In a similar way, we don't need to look to indigenous cultures for a shamanic understanding and a psychedelic understanding. We have that in the West as well. Not that we couldn't benefit from, obviously we're one planet now, and we all need to learn about each other. But it's just like, we don't need to pretend like, because in a way, often what I'll see happen is people will talk about the West as though it's so different from the rest of the world in a negative sense, that it's all about reason and alienation from nature and control over nature and so on. But that's making the West more special than it actually is. Because we also have this other side that we've just forgotten. You know, so rather than make us seem more special by demeaning us as so radically different from the rest of the human species over the course of our history, I think we can rediscover these hidden strains within Western culture that make us more like indigenous peoples and Eastern religions and so on. The title of this first talk was the psychedelic Eucharist.
Right.
And so an important part of this is not just, you know, taking psychedelics and having fun with your friends or something. It's doing it in a ritual container.
Sure.
And as I think ritual for me is a kind of, paradoxically, a kind of serious play.
Yeah.
It's play that you take seriously. As play, though, it doesn't have an end outside of itself. It's not like work or labor in that sense, where you're doing something now that's kind of grueling and difficult in order to produce a finished product or to get somewhere.
Right.
With play, it's about what's happening in the act of doing it. And I think ritual should be understood in the same way. Mm-hmm. I think in our modern context, those people that still do participate in religious ritual think of it as a kind of work,
right,
where you're trying to prove yourself as a dedicated member of this religion. You're trying to look good in God's eyes or whatever. Yeah. And by approaching ritual in that way, you're blocking the what actually functions as the sort of saving grace that one is trying to produce in the ritual state. So the ritual is an end in itself, right? And psychedelics really help catalyze that kind of an experience. And the reason this is ecologically important is that if you think about what's destroying the planet, it's the fact that we work too much. Right. It's our industrial society that's driven to make a profit. You know, it's always, we got to move faster. We got to be more productive. We got to get more work done. If we would move to a 3-day work week and spend 4 days just celebrating our existence with each other.
Oh man, how about it?
I think that would be, because we got to do some work, of course.
I'm with you.
But we're working way too much. Yeah. That's not the purpose of life. So I think, the rebirth of a kind of psychedelic religion is crucial to any sort of shift in our culture and our consciousness that will get us off the path that we're currently on, which is heading straight to extinction for ourselves and for many other species that will unfortunately take with us. That's going to be a big part of it if we turn this ship around.
I agree, man, wholeheartedly. I think that's well said, and it leads perfectly into, you know, what's coming up this summer, right? The International Whitehead Conference, because that's what you guys are going to be talking about out there.
Yeah.
And you was it facilitating or organizing a track?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of, I think, 70 or 80 tracks at this huge conference. John Cobb has been calling it his swan song. He's really trying to make this his final effort. Yeah. You know, he's 90 years old. He's still going strong, don't get me wrong, but really, he wants this to be the final injection of Whitehead's brilliance into the academic, intellectual, and ecological activist culture to make the 21st century a Whiteheadian century. So there's going to be 12 different sections having to do with everything from world religions to science, natural science, to psychology, to the history of philosophy. My track is in a section called Alienation from Nature. That's asking, all the tracks in that section are asking how this alienation arose and what we can do to ameliorate that. And my track is called Late Modernity's Reductive Monism, or Reimagining Late Modernity's Reductive Monism. Because a lot of times people will criticize a sort of dualism that emerged with the Enlightenment. This sort of Cartesian perspective where the human mind is separated from the body and the rest of nature, and the human mind has this freedom, whereas nature is totally determined. And that sort of picture is where the sort of Enlightenment politics was born, that the human being can organize themselves in free societies by controlling nature, which is just a machine, and so on. At this point in the 20th century, we've moved into a new situation where even the human being is being understood as a kind of machine to be manipulated and controlled by an elite class of technocrats that are trying to organize an efficient economy. So the whole purpose of human life now is no longer to organize into free democratic societies, but rather to raise human beings, to educate human beings, to produce human beings in a sort of factory system of education, to be good workers, good consumers, where the end goal and the only value for our civilization is to produce more money. So that's the reductive monism part. Human beings are just cogs in the machine for the techno-capitalist system. So we're trying to use Whitehead to critique that understanding of the human being and to go back in time a little bit, because it was really when Darwin articulated his theory of evolution that all of a sudden it became possible to understand the human being as just another mechanistic body system that evolved randomly from the rest of the machines on the planet. As Richard Dawkins calls us, the body is the organism is just a survival machine for its genes, which are competing selfishly to make copies of themselves. Which, from my perspective, that's just projecting capitalist relations onto the biosphere. Where in capitalism, the idea is that money rules everything. Money's trying to make copies of itself, and we're just the vessels to help money make more copies of itself. That's how Dawkins is understanding genes and the biological world. There's another way, another path forward from Darwin, though, which is that instead of, when we recognize that human beings are part of the same evolutionary family as all the rest of the life on Earth, instead of saying that, oh, well then because nature is just a machine, then human beings must just be mechanical too, and our souls, our consciousness, it's just an illusion of language or something. We can make the opposite move and say, oh, if human beings are continuous with the rest of life on Earth, then all life must in fact be ensouled. All life must have an interior dimension, just like human beings. And that leads straight to a sort of Whiteheadian panpsychism. It's a very different understanding of what it means for human beings to be continuous with the rest of life. Right? So if we take that alternative path, I think we can articulate an alternative form of modernity that isn't bent on transforming everything into one-time use and disposed consumable goods, and with the only value being increasing profits and so on. We can articulate a different set of motivations for human activity on the planet that would look very different than current capitalist relations. So we're going to have 9 or 10 different speakers. A lot of them are professors from my program at CIIS and other thinkers from around the country and the world who are going to try to engage in that project together.
You should tell people about your website and where they can read your stuff.
It's footnotes 2 Plato.com. And I post videos there, essays, blog posts that are more informal. I really love engaging with other people on the internet, almost obsessively at sometimes. I encourage people to come check it out and drop me a comment or an email. I love to discuss ideas with new people who have their own interesting ideas. My name on Twitter is Thou Art That, which is also my YouTube channel. I don't tweet too much, but I do post links from my website and from YouTube on Twitter, so it's a good place to keep track of everything that I post, I guess.
Great, man.